The air felt heavy, sharp with the metallic taste of blood, mixing with dust churned up by restless feet. Low whispers rolled through the crowd like distant thunder, rising and falling until they were cut short by the crack of whips snapping against stone. Then the figures appeared. A line of men and women in plain robes, faces drained of color but unbroken, were pushed forward toward the execution grounds. One woman stood out among them. Her hair hung loose down her back, untouched by bindings, and she walked upright, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the walls, even as guards jabbed her forward. The order from the throne had been unmistakable: renounce your faith or die. When the first blade caught the sunlight, a gasp rippled through the onlookers. No one turned away. No one dared. This was not random cruelty, not a moment of uncontrolled rage. This was the opening strike of something far larger, a force that would roll across an empire and leave thousands dead in its wake. And as blood soaked into the earth, the real terror revealed itself. This wasn't just the end of a single life. It was the birth of an unrelenting storm. What you're about to hear involves systematic torture and execution, including acts committed against women who had devoted their lives to their faith. These events come from ancient chronicles, but they're deeply unsettling. If you need to step away, that's understandable. For those who stay, we're not here to sensationalize suffering. We're here to examine how power transforms belief into a battlefield. Because this was not chaos driven by a mad king's impulse. It was a carefully constructed machine, fueled by fear and politics, designed to crush what the state perceived as a growing internal threat. In the 4th century, the Sasanian Empire stretched from the Euphrates to the Indus. It was a colossus of trade, armies, and tradition, rooted deeply in ancient Zoroastrian belief. Its king ruled a land threaded with caravan routes and guarded by fortified cities, while fire temples burned across the plains in honor of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of light. But the empire did not stand alone. To the west loomed Rome, a rival that had just embraced Christianity as both faith and banner. At first, tensions were familiar ones: border disputes, diplomatic posturing, military pressure along contested frontiers. But as Rome redefined itself through Christianity, something shifted. Inside Persia, Christians began to look less like a religious minority and more like potential collaborators. To the state, belief and loyalty blurred into one dangerous question: who did these people truly serve? What followed was a persecution that stretched across 4 decades. It wasn't personal, it wasn't spontaneous, it was about control, about enforcing loyalty, about erasing any spark that might ignite rebellion. And the reason it still echoes today is because it shows how easily religion and state can collide, turning ordinary people into symbols and targets. Yet even beneath the terror, resistance flickered. Quietly, persistently, preserving stories that would outlast the empire itself. Picture the Sasanian world at its height. Vast rivers slicing through deserts, cities rising like jeweled islands under endless skies. Kings claimed divine authority from ancient gods. Priests tended sacred fires that were never allowed to die. Trade caravans carried silk, spices, and silver, feeding a bureaucracy that recorded every tax and tribute with ruthless precision. But by the early 4th century, cracks were forming. Nomadic raids tested the borders. Rome pressed harder in the west. And into this unstable world, a child was born who would rule longer than any king before him. In the year 309, the 3rd son of the late ruler entered the world amid palace intrigue and uncertainty. His father had been dead for months. Power hung in a dangerous vacuum. Fearing collapse, nobles and priests made a radical decision. They placed the crown upon the belly of the pregnant queen and declared the unborn child king. His name was Shapur, the second of that name. Raised under regents, Shapur learned early that authority was fragile and easily challenged. While he was still young, Arab raiders surged in from the south, plundering coastal towns. By his teenage years, Shapur took direct control, driving them back across the Gulf. He fortified cities, built dams to control rivers, and expanded trade routes that strengthened the empire's wealth. But success bred suspicion. Rome, now led by emperors who openly championed Christianity, began interfering in neighboring regions like Armenia, where kings converted to the cross. Two events hardened Shapur into the architect of terror he would become. First came a humiliating stalemate in the 320s, when Roman forces held firm against his campaigns. Rumors spread through court circles. Perhaps Christians within Persia prayed for Rome's victory. Then, in 337, news arrived that changed everything. The Roman Emperor Constantine had died. Constantine, who had written letters urging protection for Christians inside Persian lands. To Shapur, the message was clear. Christianity was no longer just a faith. It was a Roman instrument. That spring, as flowers bloomed across the plains, Shapur made his move. He issued decrees doubling taxes on Christians and demanded their leaders collect the payments themselves, framing it as a test of loyalty. When they refused, the machine roared to life. Priests mobilized to identify dissenters. Informants reported secret gatherings. Executions were staged in public spaces. This wasn't blind fury. It was strategy. Weed out the disloyal. Strengthen Zoroastrian unity. Fund endless war. But policies have consequences, and what began as control quickly spiraled, consuming lives across the empire. In the capital, where rivers converged and authority pulsed, the first great confrontation approached. Seleucia Ctesiphon stood as the heart of the empire. Twin cities along the Tigris, alive with merchants shouting prices, artisans firing kilns, and palaces gleaming with glazed brick. Incense drifted from fire altars. Fresh bread rose from communal ovens. On most days, crowds gathered to hear official proclamations. But on one day in 341, tension hung in the air like dry lightning. Among the city's Christians was Simeon, a bishop known for his quiet strength and unyielding faith. In his 40s, he had risen from modest beginnings, studying scripture by lamplight and guiding small gatherings in riverside homes. Before the persecutions, his days were filled with counsel, shared meals of flatbread and dates, and baptisms conducted under star-filled skies. He knew the danger. Roman envoys had passed along warnings, urging endurance. But Simeon believed faith stood above empires. When Shapur's tax decree reached the city, Simeon gathered his community. "We serve a higher king," he told them. His voice did not waver. Refusal was defiance, but to him, it was integrity. The confrontation unfolded slowly. Palace messengers summoned Simeon before Zoroastrian priests draped in silk, sacred flames dancing in bronze bowls. "Collect the tribute," they demanded, "or suffer the consequences." Simeon stood in his plain tunic, a stark contrast to their finery. "Our loyalty is to God, not gold." Word spread fast. Whispers filled alleyways. Prayers echoed in hidden rooms. That night, guards came. Simeon was chained and dragged away with others who refused to comply. In prison, damp stone walls rang softly with hymns, fragile light pushing back the dark. The end came swiftly. On a Christian holy day, Crowds gathered outside the city walls. Simeon and his companions, priests and deacons, were led out in full view. Blades rose, blades fell. Lives ended in brutal finality. Simeon was last. His words of forgiveness cut through the silence. But this was never about one man. It was a message. A line with Rome, and the empire would crush you. Chroniclers record more than 100 deaths that day alone, and as families claimed the bodies of their dead, something unexpected happened. Faith did not disappear. It retreated inward, growing quieter and stronger. From the capital, the shadow spread. From the capital, the shadow spread outward like ink soaking into parchment. What began with bishops and deacons soon reached entire communities. In towns along the Euphrates, informers quietly took note of who no longer attended Zoroastrian rites. Priests compiled names, passing them to officials who offered rewards in return. Lighter taxes, seized land, protection from suspicion. Fear became currency. Neighbors watched neighbors. Trust collapsed under the weight of survival. Executions shifted from the heart of the empire to its provinces, where local governors competed to prove their loyalty to the throne. Zeal became a performance. Numbers climbed. Monasteries emptied as their inhabitants were marched away to isolated grounds beyond city walls. Some never returned. Others returned only as warnings. To understand how deeply this reached, step into the eyes of a traveler passing through the region. A merchant from the east, accustomed to danger on desert roads, recorded what he saw in roadside caravanserais. He wrote of how the persecution intensified, not just against leaders, but against women who had once been considered untouchable. These women lived in quiet enclaves near rivers or gardens. Consecrated to their faith, they spent their days weaving cloth, tending the sick, and praying in shared silence. They owned little. They threatened no one. Yet accusations began to circulate. Whispers of witchcraft, of disloyal prayers, of curses spoken against the crown. One group of sisters living near a riverside settlement refused to renounce their beliefs when summoned. Guards arrived at dawn. The merchant watched from a distance as they were dragged into the open. Their protests met with shouts from officials and cries from onlookers who feared being associated with them. Torches flared as night fell. Interrogations followed under flickering light. The goal was not truth, it was submission. The chronicles describe moments that stop short of full detail, as if even the writers could not bring themselves to record everything. One young woman, vowed to chastity, was accused of cursing the queen during an illness. She denied it. Her refusal sealed her fate. What happened to her left scars not just on her body, but on the collective memory of the community. The suffering was deliberate, calculated to shatter resolve. And yet, even here, humanity flickered. In one village, a guard assigned to watch the prisoners was moved by their calm. Under cover of darkness, he slipped them bread and water. It was a small act, dangerous and meaningless in the larger machine, but it mattered. It reminded them they were still seen as human. Still, the wave did not stop. Across regions, hundreds were taken, then thousands. What followed would push the empire to its limits, as resistance grew quieter, but bolder. By the mid-340s, Shapur's wars with Rome burned hotter than ever. Each campaign drained resources and sharpened suspicion. Every defeat reinforced his belief that Christians within his borders were a fifth column, praying for his downfall. In the capital once again, attention turned to those who remained unbroken. Among them was Tharba. Tharba was Simeon's sister. In her 30s, she had devoted her life to faith after losing her family at a young age. Where Simeon had been a public leader, Tharba worked quietly. She tended the sick, comforted the grieving, and hosted small gatherings where stories of hope passed from mouth to mouth. To many, she was an anchor in a sea of fear. That autumn, the air in Seleucia Ctesiphon grew heavy. Leaves turned gold along the Tigris. Rumors spread that the queen had fallen ill. Zoroastrian priests seized the moment. They blamed Christian sorcery. Names were whispered, then spoken aloud. Tharba and several other consecrated women were accused. They were dragged to the palace and brought before enforcers of the crown. Braziers burned nearby, flames licking upward as priests demanded submission. Worship the sun, honor the fire, acknowledge the gods of the empire. Tharba's voice did not tremble. We bow only to the Creator. Silence filled the chamber, the kind that presses against the chest. What followed tested the very core of the system Shapur had built. Bound and condemned, Tharba and her companions faced the ultimate penalty. The chronicles imply the violence without spelling it out. Bodies broken, boundaries crossed. The crowd murmured, some unable to watch. This was not a victory. It was excess. News traveled fast. Roman observers on the borders recorded the brutality, sharing it with allies and fueling opposition against Persia. Inside the empire, even loyal subjects began to question how far the crown would go. Governors in some regions slowed executions, fearing unrest. Others pushed harder, desperate to prove devotion. The machine faltered, not because it ran out of power, but because it exposed its own cruelty. The toll is impossible to calculate precisely. Ancient sources range wildly, from tens of thousands to well over 100,000 dead. Historians still argue over the numbers, piecing together fragmented records, Syriac texts, and Roman correspondence. What remains undisputed is the scale. This was one of the most sustained persecutions of its time. And yet, faith endured. As Shapur aged, the storm began to weaken. His wars slowed, his body failed him. In 379, after nearly 70 years on the throne, he died in his palace, likely from illness. The empire remained intact, but scarred. His successors eased the pressure. Christians were allowed to breathe again. Survivors rebuilt quietly. Churches rose in shadows. Scriptures were copied by candlelight. Communities scattered, some fleeing west into Roman lands, carrying with them stories that would shape early church memory. And history twisted, as it often does. Within generations, Christian influence crept into the Sasanian court itself. Queens converted, nobles followed. The machine built to erase belief failed to destroy what it targeted. Centuries later, these stories resurfaced through ink and stone. In the early 5th century, a bishop named Marus traveled through Persian lands, collecting eyewitness accounts. He recorded names, places, and deaths, preserving memories that might otherwise have vanished. His work painted vivid pictures of endurance, drawn from survivors who still carried the weight of what they'd seen. Modern archaeology has added its own testimony. Near the ruins of ancient Seleucia Ctesiphon, excavations uncovered crosses etched into stone, fragments of pottery marked with Christian symbols, silent proof of hidden faith. 20th century digs revealed mass graves, bones bearing unmistakable signs of violence. The chronicles were not legend, they were history. Why does this matter now? Because it shows how power, fused with ideology, can turn belief into a weapon. The patterns are familiar. Label a group disloyal. Strip them of protection. Reward those who betray them. The parallels stretch into modern times, into genocides and purges that followed the same logic. But it also shows something else. Resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it survives in whispers, in memory, in refusal to forget. Return to that blood-soaked ground where the first victims fell. The empire that ordered their deaths eventually crumbled. Palaces turned to dust. Thrones vanished. But the people meant to disappear did not. Their stories endured. And now, they reach you because you listened. Long after the executions slowed and the prisons emptied, the echoes remained. Survivors carried them in their bodies, in their sleep, in the way their voices dropped when certain names were spoken. Entire generations grew up knowing that faith had once been a death sentence, that survival itself was an act of defiance. In villages rebuilt from silence, Christians gathered quietly, often before dawn. They met in homes, in cellars, in abandoned structures where firelight could be hidden. Scriptures were copied by hand, letter by letter, because owning them openly was still dangerous. Parents taught children not only prayers, but caution. When to speak, when to stay silent, when to run. Some fled entirely. Families crossed borders into Roman territory, carrying nothing but memory and belief. There, their stories spread, shaping how early Christian communities understood persecution and martyrdom. Names like Simeon and Tharba were spoken not as symbols of defeat, but of endurance. Their deaths were not framed as endings, but as seeds. Inside the Sasanian Empire, the state tried to move forward. New kings focused on rebuilding alliances, restoring trade, stabilizing borders. Official policy softened. Christians were no longer hunted openly, yet scars lingered. Entire regions bore the absence of communities that had once thrived there. Fields went untended. Workshops stood empty. The cost of fear was written into the land itself. Time passed. Decades turned into generations, and something unexpected happened. Christianity did not vanish from Persia. It adapted. It learned to survive under pressure. In some courts, whispers of conversion began to surface. A noblewoman here, a royal consort there. By the time later dynasties took power, Christian influence had quietly entered the highest levels of society. What had once been treated as a foreign threat became an internal reality. History has a way of twisting irony into permanence. Centuries later, scholars began piecing the story together. In the early 5th century, Bishop Marus traveled through former Sasanian lands, gathering testimonies from aging survivors and descendants of martyrs. He recorded names, locations, and methods of execution, preserving details others wished forgotten. His writings became a cornerstone for understanding the scale and intent of the persecution. Modern archaeology confirmed what texts alone could not. Near ancient Seleucia Ctesiphon, excavations uncovered crosses etched into stone walls, hidden beneath later construction. Pottery fragments marked with Christian symbols surfaced in layers dated to the height of the persecutions. In the 20th century, mass graves were discovered, bones bearing unmistakable signs of trauma, cuts, breaks, and bindings. These were not myths shaped by devotion. They were evidence. Historians still debate the numbers. Ancient sources exaggerate. Records are incomplete. Estimates range from tens of thousands to well over 100,000 dead. The exact figure may never be known, but the intent is undeniable. This was a state-sponsored effort to eliminate a perceived internal enemy, carried out with methodical precision over decades. And that is why this story matters, because it reveals how easily power justifies brutality when ideology and fear align. when belief is framed as betrayal, when loyalty is measured by obedience rather than conscience. The same machinery appears again and again across history. Different names, different symbols, the same logic. But it also reveals something quieter, something harder to destroy. Faith survived not because it was protected, but because it was remembered. Because stories were passed down when writing was forbidden. Because compassion persisted even in small acts. A loaf of bread slipped to prisoners, a body buried with care, a name spoken aloud when silence was safer. Return, once more, to that first execution ground. The crowd, the blades, the woman walking forward with her head unbowed. The empire that ordered her death believed it was asserting control. In reality, it was exposing its fear. The Sasanian Empire eventually fell, as all empires do. Its palaces turned to dust. Its kings faded into lists and footnotes. But those meant to vanish did not. They remain in ancient pages, in buried stone, and in the echoes of history that still reach us. And now, they reach you. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you see history repeating itself today? And what lessons do you think we still haven't learned? In the end, it isn't the crowns we wear that define us. It's the systems we build and the lives they leave behind.